Is this Afghanistan's best chance for peace? After almost 2 decades of fighting, US forces begin pulling out after a deal with the Taliban. But does a leadership dispute threaten the agreement? I'm Emran Feroz, and today's newsmaker is Afghanistan's perilous path to peace. The US has been at war in Afghanistan for nearly 20 years. In that time, at least 2,000 American soldiers have been killed and more than 150,000 Afghans. Then, 2 weeks ago, Washington and the Taliban signed an historic peace deal. Now US troops are finally leaving the war-torn nation. It's meant to pave the way for talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. But there's a dispute over who's actually leading the country. Ashraf Ghani has been declared the winner of last year's election, and the international community has backed him. But his rival, Abdullah, has rejected the result. Now, both are claiming the presidency and have even held their own inaugurations. So, could political chaos in Afghanistan derail the fragile peace process? That debate in a moment. But first, Adam Pletz has this report.
These members of the Taliban are celebrating the signing of a peace deal with the US in February. The agreement will see American troops withdraw in exchange for guarantees that Afghanistan will never again host al-Qaeda or other extremist groups. The Taliban is calling it a victory.
Our message to the world is that after 20 years of conflicts with a powerful America, we are the winners. And this is because people support us.
In the longest war of its history, the US has lost at least 2,400 soldiers. And for President Donald Trump, the deal helps to deliver his campaign pledge to bring the troops home.
I spoke to the leader of the Taliban today. We had a good conversation. We've agreed there's no violence. We don't want violence. We'll see what happens. They're dealing with Afghanistan, but we'll see what happens.
Just hours later, US airstrikes hit Taliban positions in retaliation for attacks against Afghan government forces. In spite of the militants' violations, on Tuesday, Washington began withdrawing its soldiers. If the deal holds, all 13,000 US military personnel will leave within 14 months. But the US commander for the Middle East and Afghanistan, General Frank McKenzie, has already told Congress that Taliban leaders are not keeping their part of the bargain. On Tuesday, Ashraf Ghani was sworn in for a second term as president.
من از تمام کسانی که در انتخابات سهم گرفتن سپاس میکنم و از حریفان سیاسی دیروز خویش میخواهم که با من شانه بدهند و دست به دست هم داده برای این وطن مقدس خدمت نمایند.
But his main rival, Abdullah, has anything but a helping hand in mind. He contests September's election outcome and has held a simultaneous ceremony claiming the presidency as his own.
اگر در سال 2014 به هدف ثبات و وحدت ملی تن به مصلحت نمیدادیم کشور به بحران میرفت. اما اکنون موضوع کاملا برعکس است. اگر این بار تحت هر نام نتیجه تقلب را میپذیرفتیم فاتحه دموکراسی در افغانستان باید خوانده میشد.
Ghani appears to have the support of the international community. The US Special Representative for Afghanistan, Zalmay Khalilzad, and NATO Forces Commander Scott Miller both attended his swearing-in. But Abdullah could seek to form a rival government. The dispute over the presidency may have weakened Ghani's hand, forcing him to agree to a prisoner swap with the Taliban that he had previously ruled out. As part of the deal struck with the US, the Taliban will enter negotiations with the Afghan government, but with competing claims to the presidency. Who will that be? Adam Pletz, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Kabul is Mohammad Daoud Sultanzoy. He's a former presidential candidate and was an advisor to President Ashraf Ghani. In the German city of Stuttgart is Emran Feroz. He's a journalist and the founder of Drone Memorial, a virtual tribute for civilian victims of drone strikes. And in Washington, D.C. is Adam Wunische. He's a former U.S. Army sergeant who served in Afghanistan and a researcher covering Afghanistan and Pakistan at the Quincy Institute. Good to have you all on the program. A bunch of things to go through here, and we'll take them in bite-sized chunks. But Daoud Sultanzoy, the withdrawal begins. Let's start with that. Is it a good thing?
Actually, the withdrawal would be a good thing for Afghanistan because the excuse for war, which was the presence of foreign troops, will be removed, and then the sincerity of all sides who talk about peace and bringing stability to the country will be tested. So in that sense, yes, the withdrawal will be good, but of course this withdrawal has a lot of strings attached to it. Conditional-based withdrawal and all that we are not privy to the very details that we need to know as a nation.
Emran Feroz, when I spoke with Zalmay Khalilzad not too long ago, last month, I asked him if this is just the United States cutting and running. They've had enough. It's Afghanistan's problem. And he said if we wanted to cut and run, we could have done it a long time ago. We choose to leave at a good time after a peace deal with the Taliban. Is that how you see it? Do you see it as a good time for the United States to leave?
Well, I think we still have to wait and see. Obviously, Donald Trump is very keen to use the slogan, "I have ended the longest war of the United States," for his election campaign. And at the moment, it seems like that. We also don't know how this will continue in future. We don't know we don't know what happens if Donald Trump gets reelected. There are also other questions regarding the CIA's presence in Afghanistan. So I think we still have to wait and see what happens.
Adam, the United States wants to end its endless wars, but is it throwing Afghanistan under the bus by doing it right now?
No, I wouldn't say that it is throwing it under the bus. What I would say is that there is no sort of good path forward while maintaining a long-term sort of military presence. I agree with the previous speaker that the majority of the sort of legitimacy for the Taliban comes from fighting that foreign occupation, and while that stays there, they, sort of maintain that legitimacy.
Right. Daoud Sultanzoy, what's to say that the Taliban won't switch its reasons to just wanting to take over the country again once the Americans are gone?
Well, I don't think we should put too much hope on the sustainability of this path that has started, because the path is predicated on an architecture of election in the United States. So if the Taliban increase their violence and if they don't abide by the agreements with the United States after the election, maybe not before, but after the election, can use that as an excuse and increase its troops based on the conditions, or at least increase their military footprint in terms of the operations that they have the ability to increase their air raids, increase their intelligence gathering, and also the presence of special forces of the United States. All those options are still on the ground. And also the ability of the Afghan military is increasing every day. That's another thing. But of course, all sides are tired of the war. The United States, Afghanistan, both the people of Afghanistan, the government of Afghanistan, and the Taliban. The only people who are not tired of the war are those who are profiting from the war, who are in the periphery of the war. They're not even losing a person in this war, and yet they're profiting from this war both strategically and monetary. Therefore, Afghans, Americans, and the Taliban forces should recognize that this land belongs to both the Afghans and the Afghan Taliban. And if we want to fight other people's war, then that would be the most stupid reason to continue this fight.
Who are you talking about when you say that?
As you know, there are many players in this war, including our neighbors, regional countries, and even far-flung beneficiaries of this war. People have lost their lives here, both the NATO forces, including the Americans and other NATO forces, and tens of thousands of Afghans have lost their wars, including the Taliban. And yet, none of those who are pushing this proxy war other than the United States, who's involved in it, and some NATO countries. The others are not losing anything, yet they're laughing every day at the division between the Afghans and also the seasonal attempt of the United States for the election. I hope this is not an election season attempt. I hope this is a real attempt for peace. But this attempt can only be sustainable and can produce results if all sides are sincere. It's not just the United States.
You still haven't
Afghans
named
also
anybody.
have to come together and also have to recognize.
Okay, you still haven't named anybody. Are you talking about
I
Pakistan?
named everybody. All the
United
regional
States.
players.
You said regional
you know
players,
the map here.
Okay, but are you?
From
I mean, I wonder who you're talking about. Just be
I can
here,
name,
if you can.
I can start the names from Turkey all the way to where you're sitting. Turkey, India, Pakistan, the Central Asian countries, Russia, China, the Arab world. They're all they all have a stake in this war. All of them.
Okay. Well, good to know. Emran Feroz, how comfortable are you with this idea that when Ghani has finally agreed to the principle of prisoner swap with the Taliban says, no, we want all 5,000 at once. We don't want 1,500 before we even begin talks. We want you to release all of our prisoners. I mean, I doubt these prisoners are going to go and live a quiet life and become farmers, right? So are you comfortable with that?
So first of all, I think we have to focus on a serious issue here. Today, intra-Afghan talks should take place, but they are not taking place because we have a political crisis in Kabul. We have a split political elite in Kabul. We have two men who declared themselves as president, and many, many Afghans feel very, very uncomfortable with that. I mean, what is going on in Kabul? We have one government of Mr. Abdullah, one government of Ashraf Ghani, and then we also have the Islamic Emirate of the Taliban. All this mess reminds me of Afghanistan's history that took place 150 years or 200 years ago, when we had princes who declared themselves in Kabul as king at the same time. And it's very, very unfortunate that we see this at the moment, because obviously the Taliban are benefiting from this, and they will also use this. I mean, immediately after this, the deal with the Americans have been signed, the Taliban said that there is no real government in Kabul, to whom should we talk? And unfortunately, at the moment, it seems that they are kind of correct with that.
So, okay, so with Adam, with that in mind, the Taliban is negotiating from a position of strength because it doesn't have a unified opponent when it comes to this. They can turn to Ghani and say, no, we want all 5,000. We don't care about this. We're not here to, bargain with you here. We want maximum benefits out of this deal. Would the Americans be thinking, maybe we need to stick around here because we couldn't convince the two sides within Afghanistan, Abdullah and President Ghani, to come together. Maybe they need our presence here before things spiral out of control.
I think the fact that the United States, with the leverage of 13,000 troops in country, and this is the most leverage that they could get out of, is a sort of vague promise to the Taliban that they, stop supporting Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. I think it shows the limits to what an external actor can do within a country, and specifically the external military can do within that country. I think there's a lot of sort of limitations and sort of, barriers to ultimate peace that exist. And I think that if we're going to get there, I think it's going to take unified effort from everybody involved. And I think, this political crisis in Kabul is going to be a huge problem for the leverage of the Afghan government.
Imran Feroz, before I say goodbye to you, I want to ask you to what extent there is an ethnic and tribal element to this. Because a lot of the people who are supporting Abdullah are supporting him because they're anti-Ashraf Ghani, who they see as someone who was merely in it to support Pashtuns. Is there a very strong ethnic element to this, and is it going to be potentially very dangerous down the road?
It is definitely very dangerous, and if we take a look at the debate, it is, as you said, there are people, critics, observers who claim that, for example, Ashraf Ghani is a Pashtunist who is just preferring his own ethnic group, and on the other side we have people who claim that Abdullah is representing all different kinds of ethnic groups in Afghanistan. To be honest, I think it's not that easy. I mean, we could see elements of that on both sides. We could see during the election campaigns of both of them that they are using the ethnic card when they could benefit from it. For example, in 2014, we saw President Ashraf Ghani, who added the name Ahmadzai, which is the name of his tribe, just to get extra votes from the Pashtun people. So we see all these things happening. And we also see Abdullah, one time he's claiming he's more Tajik, and the other time he's claiming he's more Pashtun. Depends on the area he's visiting. And this is definitely dangerous. I think that often it is also exaggerated, especially in social media. Afghans are kind of too emotional regarding that. But at the same time, we should not forget that all these political elites at the end are sitting in the same boat. In 2014, we saw a huge dispute between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah because of these ethnic questions. And people even killed themselves because of that. We had supporters from both sides who started to attack each other. But at the end, then Foreign Secretary John Kerry came to Kabul. He selected Ghani as president, and suddenly Abdullah became the CEO, and everything was fine again.
Okay.
So both politicians are using that for their own benefits.
Imran, this is where we thank you. Thanks so much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let's bring in Jim Phillips now. He's a senior research fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. Jim, good to have you on the program. Almost 19 years on, as the United States decides, well, it's got to deal with the Taliban that is tentatively holding for now, and it's pulling out the troops. Has it all been worth it, Jim?
I don't think this deal is going to solve anything. I would not see this as a peace deal. I think this is a disengagement deal, and that disengagement has many strings tied to it, as the Afghan guest suggested. And Secretary of Defense Esper, Secretary of State Pompeo have made it clear that the second phase of the U.S. withdrawal will depend on the Taliban living up to its commitments. No one in Washington thinks that the Taliban actually will break with al-Qaeda and move it out of Afghanistan. So I think the administration will be well within its rights to postpone the second phase of the withdrawal while continuing to support the Afghan government.
Okay, so Adam, if nobody in Washington, if Jim is to be believed here, and if he's right, if nobody in Washington believes that the Taliban will cut ties with al-Qaeda, then is it a sort of conscious potential suicide here getting out right now? Or do things need to be recalibrated?
I think the right way to look at this is, I mean, he's right that nobody thinks that the Taliban are going to break with al-Qaeda, but it's also important to remember that U.S. military force can also not get the Taliban to break with al-Qaeda, right? We've tried for 18 years to get that done, and we haven't been able to do it, even with 100,000 troops in country. So it's unreasonable to think that we can get that done with 8,600 in country.
Right. Daoud Sultanzoy, I want to bring it back to the political instability and the political dispute, right? And I'm particularly interested in what you have to say here, because you're a former advisor to President Ashraf Ghani. People from the outside would look at this and say, well, how on earth are you going to have any sort of political settlement with the Taliban or anyone else if you can't have a political settlement among yourselves? That's fair, isn't it?
Actually, it's not a political settlement that needs to be settled. The election was held. The election process was followed. Electoral commissions made their final decision. All the inspections and all the processes that were required, we went through. And then finally, one person has one extra vote, and that needs to be declared the winner. So naturally, some people do not accept no for an answer. For example, the other side. This is the third election that they're disputing and not accepting. That's one side of the story. The biggest problem that I see that everybody's forgetting is the people of Afghanistan. The irony is that the people are the biggest sufferer of this war, and nobody worries about that. The elite, so-called elite in this country, in the political structure is such that only force and money talks here. We don't have political organizations that are grassroots oriented. Therefore, those who have guns, they talk about politics, and then they hold buildings and, as you see, groups of followers hostage, and they push for whatever they want for their own self-interest. The other side of the equation, of course, is the United States of America as a superpower. In this situation and all situations of this sort, United States military will not bring its credibility for the United States. United States legitimacy comes from its credible conduct in situations like this. So I do not fault the United States or Mr. Trump or anybody to strike a deal with the Taliban, whether it's election-oriented or not. They have to look after their own interest, and we have to find what our interest is. And this is where the fault of the political elite comes.
Right.
They have always looked after their own self-interest, and they've forgotten the people.
So,
and
right.
the people are the last to be remembered, but they're the first who will make the decision finally.
So Jim Phillips, the details of September's election, that's almost irrelevant now, because the other side, I mean, whether Abdullah has a legitimate case or not is almost irrelevant, because they've had rival inaugurations. Abdullah wants to set up a parallel government. He's doing that, right? And he has a lot of support that in many ways almost matches Ashraf Ghani's. So when you look at it from that perspective, the conditions, the facts of the election almost become irrelevant. Are we seeing Afghanistan in the middle of a power struggle between two very powerful men with two very different backers? And is this going to go south very alarmingly and very dangerously?
Well, I don't think that it will lead to fighting between the factions, but it is alarming in a political sense, and because both must cooperate if they're going to extract a genuine peace from the Taliban, if that's possible. And I think the Taliban believes that once the U.S. has started its withdrawal, that the Afghan government will basically fall to it. But I think that's going to be very difficult as long as U.S. air power is engaged, and I don't see that going away. But I think Zalmay Khalilzad has his work cut out for him more almost with the Afghan government factions than with the Taliban, because I don't think the Taliban is serious about diplomacy.
Adam, is Jim right? Adam, can you hear me? Okay, we've lost Adam. Okay, we've got about a minute left on the program. Daoud Sultanzoy, I'm going to redirect that to you. I want to ask you, if the Taliban's not serious about diplomacy, are you afraid that they're just going to wait it out until the Americans are gone, and then they're going to unleash all their power on the Afghan government and try to retake the Afghan institutions?
I tend to not think that way. I think the Taliban, unfortunately, are seeing a very, very sad situation amongst the politicians in Afghanistan. So they will not have to resort to any military means. They will see that our military and our police will also be witnessing a situation where the political groups who cannot get along or who cannot come to an agreement in divvying power for self-interest, then naturally I don't think there will be a full-fledged war of any sort. I don't think there will be any kind of problem for another player to come and insert itself. So in that sense, I think this should be an alarm bell for the political groups inside Afghanistan to come along and realize the fact and wake up to the situation.
Okay, Daoud Sultanzoy, Adam Wunische, Jim Phillips, and earlier Emran Feroz. Pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. I wish you all the best. Before we go, we'll leave you with this little lesson from history. The only leader to ever successfully withdraw all his nation's troops from Afghanistan was Mikhail Gorbachev. He was the newsmaker on this day 35 years ago when he became the leader of the Soviet Union. Here's the focus of our Rewind today. Take a look.
В силу сложившейся ситуации с образованием Содружества независимых государств я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР.
Thanks so much for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.